I better turn my attention to the diaphragm here in the shutter case, because I've been busy dealing with the front part first, and that's really not the order things are done. So I've got the retainer plate here, 2 screws. That holds the settings lever from the back of the shutter through to the internal plate. Which is this piece here. I'll tip that upside down and reclaim the screws and pop them to one side. Now, here we get to the tricky bit. I'll tip this upside down. And here we've got the diaphragm blades, a nice neat rosette. They're a bit sticky. You can see they don't want to come apart. I've seen greasier ones than that. Here's the settings plate. This part swings left or right depending on the setting of the lever, and therefore swings the blades inwards or outwards, their pivot points being in the case. So these components all need to be cleaned, get rid of all that dirty old grease. I have to say this is not as greasy as the mechanism plate was. And these blades are just effectively glued together with oil. I'll separate those in a second. Start with the easy stuff. So I'll clean the case, clean that plate, clean the settings lever. I'm just using some naphtha. There's a little bit of dirt and grease coming off there. I want all of that off. The shutter was not lubricated with that nasty green grease that I struck elsewhere in the camera. Fortunately. The shutter, of course, originally would have been assembled not by Kodak but by Rocol. It's a product of the Rocol factory. Quite possibly they came to the factory complete with the lenses and already installed, ready to be for the shutter to be fitted to the camera body. Alternatively, the shutters may have arrived bare and had the lenses fitted at the Kodak factory. Either would be an option. That case is cleaning up quite well. The thread for the retainer ring is cleaning out well too, so that's a good sign. And this plate, which is the moving plate, in this case it acts as the retainer plate too, because of the construction of the shutter. This holds the diaphragm blades in position. Well, you can see some definite green grease there, I think. That's come through from the back, I would imagine. Yeah, that was on the back of this plate. I imagine that's seeped its way in from the focus mount. What happens if you've got oil or worse on the diaphragm blades is that they'll stick together, particularly in cold weather. You'll notice that, and as a result, when you push on the lever, something's going to give. The blades don't want to move and you're pulling very hard on one end of them. One of two things happens: the blades will distort, or the rivets that form the little pivot points for the blades will tear out of the blade, rendering it useless. But in milder cases the blades will simply distort. And that means that when you are trying to reassemble the diaphragm, as I will be shortly, it can be awkward when the blades will not lie flat because they're all bent out of shape. That's cleaned up well. Let's have a look at these diaphragm blades. There's two stuck together. You can probably see, if I angle that to the light, you can see it. There's a patch of oil here, and that's where the blades have overlapped, and there'll be a matching patch of oil on this blade. Yeah, you can just see that there. So all the blades will be like that. They'll all need to be swabbed clean. It doesn't look like there's any corrosion or any problem like that with them. It'll just be oils, and it's a major nuisance. So the blades are quite delicate. You have to be careful when you're swabbing them not to catch the cotton bud on them, because you can bend them out of shape. Once as I said, once they're no longer flat, they are very, very awkward to get back into position. The blades are not symmetrical. The rivets on one end and the pivot points are in different positions relative to the centre line of the blade. And the pivots are typically different heights too. This is a shallower pivot point. It goes to the moving plate. This one is a taller pivot that goes into the case. And if you mix it up, it won't go well for you. They'll stick through the back of the plate and catch on shutter blades. So I'll have to be very careful to lay these out so that I know which way up they are once I've cleaned them for the reassembly process, because one misplaced blade can cause you a lot of nuisance. There's a blade loose by itself. I'll deal with that first. Separate its glued together siblings shortly. Here I've got the window light coming in from my right, and I can judge from the reflections on the blades whether I've got them clean, whether they're free of oil, or whether they're, these are sticky. Now the diaphragm blades are interleaved. Shutter blades, when you're placing them in the camera, there's a first blade and a last blade. The blades are stacked in one on top of the other effectively. But in the diaphragm the blades are all interleaved. There is no first blade or last blade. Each blade sits on top of the next blade at one end and is tucked underneath the next blade at the other end, which makes it awkward to assemble. Sometimes there'll be scuff marks on the blades where they've been rubbing over each other as the aperture's been changed, and that's a problem that can actually be worsened by oil on the blades, because when there's oil on the blades it can stick the blades together. They suck down tight together, and so it actually creates more friction rather than acting as a lubricant as you might otherwise expect. And although the blades are quite highly polished and of their nature you'd expect that surface not to present any high friction, the very edges of the blades will be quite sharp. So if the blades are distorted, if the blades are stuck together, those sharp edges act like, I suppose, act like planer blades as they slide over the blades, or a scraper, act like a scraper. I'm looking at the state of these blades, and I'm looking at the blades seem to lie fairly flat, but some of the rivets on them, the blades look a little bit distorted where those rivets are, which suggests that the diaphragm has been forced while the blades have been sticky, and that stress is shown up at the pivots where they're just riveted through the blades. This will be a bit awkward assembling this diaphragm because of the way the diaphragm is constructed here. Sorry about the banging noises in the background. My neighbour is doing some building renovations of an indeterminate nature, and she can spend entire weekends sawing and banging, and there's never anything to show for it. It's one of life's mysteries. Right, those blades are clean. I'll clean these two shoulder screws while I've got them here. And then I will take pains to reassemble this diaphragm before the video camera packs up because it's flashing the battery light. I'll start reassembling the diaphragm. I'll start with the moving plate. This is going down on my jig so that the recessed screw holes here are down facing the jig. And then I've got to get the blades sorted out. And each blade has to be placed in here. And the shallow rivets go into this plate. This will be awkward to assemble because it's a bit like assembling the diaphragm back to front. You could, in theory, assemble the diaphragm into the case. That would have some advantages and some serious disadvantages. The most serious disadvantage is it's awkward trying to swing blades around and position them correctly into a recess like that. Though it's always easier to assemble diaphragm blades by putting the pivots into the fixed plate, the ones with the holes, rather than the moving plate, the ones with the slots. And here we're putting them into the moving plate. So as you work your way around, you have to pull back the earlier blades to expose the holes for the later blades without disturbing anything. So this could easily be one of those cases where I have to do the job multiple times. One more to go. It's in place, but I've got to lift these blades over the top without disturbing anything. And swing them all back into position neatly. Alright, so there's the blades mounted on the moving plate. My next trick is to get the case back over that in the correct position and get each of these 10 pins into their correct hole here in the case. Fun. I'll study this for a second. I've got to get this, it only swings through an arc this big where that slot is. If I position this at the wrong end of the arc, things won't work. Let me study this for a second so I know what I'm doing. Alright, I thought I'd decided what I was doing. I'm not so sure now. Hang on a minute. Okay, when that is that way, let's try this. See if I can wriggle those pivots in. I heard a lot of them drop in. I felt them drop in. It looks promising. Lift my jig up over the top. Here's my aperture settings ring. Get that correctly positioned. Do the holes line up? They look like they do. I'll put one of the screws in, run it in lightly. Run its mate in lightly. Take that out. Look at that. It opens and closes through its full range. That was a success. I can do up those 2 screws. Now this is not loose, but I know from the state of the diaphragm, because I've cleaned it, that there is no problem with stickiness on the blades, and the friction is between the setting lever here and the case, and it'll be because this has a slight set to it to provide some friction there, and it's to stop it flapping around loose. There are no click stops. You don't want the setting so loose that you easily knock it and lose your settings. So I'm checking now very carefully to make sure that I put the blades in the right way round and that none of these pivots are sticking up above the top of this plate. If they are, they would catch on the shutter blades, and that would cause me grief. Alright, that appears to be good. So far so good. The shutter case is good. And I can turn my attention back to the mechanism plate and the shutter blades, or the mechanism plate first. So the mechanism plate is here, it's cleaned. I've got my black paint in there. I can see I've got a bit in the threads that I'll want to remove before I put that lens down in there. But generally speaking, that's all good. Just shake out that loose stuff. So the mechanism plate. Right, I've got the parts all cleaned. I put them through the ultrasonic cleaner too, while I was in the habit of doing it. So the blade actuating ring needs to go on first. I'll get that sorted out. So here's the ring. It goes on in one position. If I can figure out which position it is, we'll be in business. Goes on there. Of course, it has to tuck under the edge of the case at that point. So I've got to feed it in there, and that drops in there. That's good. And that was held in position with our little brass screws, which went where? Here. I'll spin these in. It started. Just spin that in with a toothpick. I'll tighten that in a second. And its mate over here. Yes, that's started. I can tighten those down with my tweezers. That's fine. So my blade actuating ring should move freely. It does. That's a vast improvement over what it was previously. And the lever that operates that on the top of the shutter I have here. Oh, I'm busy just trying to pick this up with those tweezers that I mutilated earlier in the process of dealing with this camera. I'm just going to try and unmutilate them now. I've seen better examples than that, but they'll do. Here's the lever, there's the screw. This lever I'd normally just put a touch of molybdenum paste through its pivot point here, and the little slot, it's got a little slot where it couples to the blade actuating ring, and I usually put a touch of molybdenum paste through there, and we'll put the screw in. Now molybdenum paste is, you don't need to use much, you just need to leave like a dirty mark really, that's usually enough. I'll hook its spring back up. That blade actuating ring is very snappy in its action now. I'll check this retard gear train, check that it moves through its action. Seems good. I'm going to lubricate both the blade actuating ring and my retard gear train with some graphite powder. And I've got a container here which has some loose graphite powder in it because I use it all the time for doing this sort of job. So I'll just pick up some of that graphite powder, drop it into the gears of my retard gear train, hold back the pallets at this end with my finger, can you see that? The pallets here, hold back that pallet lever, and then swing the arm in at this point repeatedly to work that graphite powder in there. Just knock out any excess. The blade actuating ring, I just want to tip some on that surface where those notches are that couple to the shutter release, and basically just work the lever backwards and forwards. It's got a return spring on it, so I'm only going to knock it in one direction, just to work some graphite powder in between the blade actuating ring and that aluminium body. Likewise, knock out any excess, and I'll go and blow any excess away and be back.